I'm excited to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Katie Turo. Katie is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Fordham University, and Dr. Turo's lab studies the causes and consequences of biodiversity change. So today, Katie's going to help us understand how bees survive in urban areas and what you can do to help. So thank you, Katie.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Katie Turo, and today I'm going to be talking to you about protecting pollinators in urban areas. I'm going to give a brief overview about bee diversity, talk about bee decline, the pros and cons for bees living in a city, and some landscape and habitat scale considerations for bees too. So kind of just right here. Backing up a little bit. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Matt. So yes, I'm a professor at Fordham University in New York City. I got my doctorate in entomology at The Ohio State University. And if you're interested in what our lab is doing, you can check out this a, website here, turolab.com. And I also wanted to put a plug in since I know there's a lot of people here who maybe work with Extension or with 4-H, that I also was the author of the Insect Adventures curriculum for Ohio. So this is for Ohio's 4-H program, where we have an entomology focused program. So if you're interested in working with youth and talking about insects, that's also something that's available for people beyond Ohio, also relevant to New York State as well. Okay. So first off, I want to start by giving some context about global bee diversity. So there are 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and even 5,000 or so species in North America, and we estimate around 450 species in New York. So broadly speaking, there are a lot of unique bee species in this region and globally too. But both of these species for North America and also New York State, my laser pointer out, don't actually include the honeybee, which is a European species that was actually introduced to North America by European colonists. The other distinction I want to make is that we consider honeybees to be more like domesticated animals, like chickens, whereas today the bees that I'm focusing my talk on are the native species in this region, who are more comparable to chickadees and cardinals and robins. So they're more like the wild birds that we see in the forests and areas around us, whereas we think of honeybees more as domesticated products too. And what's important about this distinction is that just like wild birds are different from chickens, wild bees are also ecologically different from honeybees and are facing unique challenges in the world around them too. So what else do we need to know about wild bees in this region? So we're going to do a quick crash course so everyone's on the same page. So the first thing to know is that wild bees' sizes and colors can vary. So there's just a huge diversity in this region and also globally too. So for example, there are large bees. You guys are probably familiar with carpenter bees, especially if they nest in your house a little bit. They can be a bit of a pest. So there are carpenter bees, and this is the same carpenter bee's face. And here's a small Perdita bee here that is smaller than the carpenter bee's eyes. So there is a huge variety in size and also color too. Second is the vast majority of bees are actually solitary nesters. And by this, I mean that typically only one female creates her individual nest during her 3 to 8 week life stage as an adult. And this is different than honeybees or bumblebees, which typically nest in colonies and are more social species too. So most bees are solitary. And as you might have anticipated from the previous slide, most wild bees are actually ground nesters as well. So they're digging into the soil to make these underground tunnels. And they make these little chambers here where they lay their eggs. So you can imagine you might see a hole in the ground, and a bee would actually be digging this tunnel and making an underground chamber where they would put a pollen provision and then lay a little egg on top of it too. So this is a little egg pollen provision there, and you can see a little white dot. That would be the schematic of the bee larvae too. And then in comparison, so most bees nest below ground, but some bees also nest in cavities too. And these could include things like hollow stems or beetle tunnels in which the bees are going to, again, collect pollen and create like a pollen provision or pollen ball, and then lay an egg on it as well too. So within each nesting cell, here you could see there's a bee's egg, a pollen provision, and a little partition between the room that the bee is developing within too. And this is where the adult female is providing her young with what she needs to develop after they hatch from an egg. And this leads me to my last key point, which is that all bee larvae eat pollen for protein, and the adults also drink nectar from flowers to get energy from sugar inside nectar. So, when we consider how best to support wild bees in urban areas, what we're typically thinking about is how can we provide the food and nesting resources that unique bee species prefer. But why do we care about bees at all, too? So I just kind of want to back up, and this might be preaching to the choir here, but I think that there's two arguments to make about why we care about bee species and why we might want to protect them in the areas around of us. So first of all, there's this moral or ethical argument that maybe all species have some intrinsic value. But secondly, bees are also fortunate to be a species or group of species that also have a lot of instrumental value to humans because they're benefiting human society by providing pollination to a lot of the food items that we care about, like pumpkins. And native bees in particular can be very efficient pollinators because of their morphology and also their behavior. So, on the morphology side, native bees often have different places where they collect pollen, which make them more efficient at moving it from one flower to the other. So, for example, here, this megachile has some hairs on the dense part of its underside of its abdomen. So, when it lands on a flower, it immediately picking up pollen, makes it quicker to move pollen from one place to the other, too. Native bees, like bumblebees, can also show behaviors like buzz pollination, in which they would attach to a flower and shake it really hard, and the pollen all comes out onto their body, which makes them way more efficient pollinators. And this is really good news, especially for urban areas, because the United Nations estimates that there are over 800 million urban farmers worldwide that stand to benefit from the pollination services that native urban bees can provide. So, unfortunately, we now know that bee populations and also the pollination services that bees provide are currently under some threat. So, there's growing evidence for bee decline over the past decade. So, a couple lines of evidence that we have. For instance, there's this long-term monitoring program in the United Kingdom, which has shown that a third of British pollinators have declined between 1980 and 2013, with bee declines highlighted here in blue and hoverflies or syrphid flies here highlighted in red too. And this is growing more severe since 2007. Museum records from the American Museum of Natural History have also shown that over 140 years, there's been significant changes in relative abundance for 56% of 438 species that we have data for. And lastly, collection records have shown substantial range constrictions for some species. So, for example, here we have the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which is a federally listed endangered species. And it used to be found throughout this whole entire black region here on this map of the United States, but now it can only really be found in the upper Midwest and some parts of the Appalachian Mountain Range, too. So, what's causing these declines? Well, as my collaborator Dave Wagner at UConn likes to put it, bees are experiencing death by a thousand cuts. So, globally, there are many stressors that bees are subjected to, and this can include pollution, land use change, and climate change. And not only are these challenges contributing to species decline, but they're also just changing patterns of biodiversity, resulting in novel communities and new species interactions as well, too. So, as this figure suggests, all of these changing conditions can challenge insect species globally, but we can also see some positive influences too. So, for instance, if we take the case of urbanization, in some ways, urbanization can negatively affect bee species. So, for example, we talked about most bees nest in the ground, and urban areas can contain high amounts of pavement and other impervious surfaces that can restrict where bees can nest. So, that would be a negative stressor on bees. We also can think about what else bees require. They require pollen and nectar, and some bees can be specialist bees that only feed on a couple plant species or maybe only one type of plants. And so these specialist bees, dietary specialists, can also be more sensitive to urbanization if it coincides with the decrease of a particular plant that they like. But on the other hand, urban areas can also provide really abundant food resources for bees because people tend to plant flowers in their backyards and parks. And we all know from research that floral abundance really predicts bee abundance as well. And cities can also provide really great nesting habitat for cavity nesting bees. So those are the ones that nest in like straws or holes too. And this is in part because many bees can nest in man-made structures like masonry cracks in buildings. So brick buildings often have these little cracks that these bees can kind of come into and nest in. And they also like hollow stems, and people plant plants that have hollow stems too, like raspberry canes or teasel. So while life in the Anthropocene can be really challenging for some bee species, it can also provide opportunities, specifically if considering urban areas. And given these variable trends, we can expect negative and positive factors. It's really important to think about what determines a city's value for pollinators. So today I'm just going to talk briefly about some case studies of research that I did in Cleveland, Ohio, where this photograph is taken. And this is where we considered what might influence the city's value for pollinators. So much of my research to date has taken place in a large-scale experiment in urban Cleveland, Ohio, where we installed 5 urban green space habitats across 8 neighborhoods in Cleveland. And the goal of these green spaces was to compare whether if you had flowers or grass or just turf grass, how would that influence the ecological value of these habitats for bees, and what characteristics about these habitats might be important, as well as where they are in the landscape. So within each of our 40 research green spaces, we monitored bees with trap nests, and these essentially function like bird houses. Oh, there's got to be an auto forward on this. But these essentially function as bird houses, which monitor which bees can come in and take use of these supplementary cavities. So within these little birdhouses for bees, we're able to count how many bee larvae were developing in a given site. And we also x-rayed their nests to characterize larval health, which way you can count the bees and you can see whether there's a fungal infection, parasitoid wasps, or another insect feeding off of the bee, or whether they're just healthy as well. Using this data, we're able to ask the question, does urban bee nesting success vary with green space design or the landscape configuration within the urban habitat? And jumping right ahead to results, we're not going to dwell on the methods of this here. We found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that turf grass had a lot less value for bees than a site that was seeded with native flowering plants. So we found that in habitats like this, we found bees were nesting more frequently, they had more larvae per nest, and they also attracted a different group of native bee species too. And you can also imagine that these turfgrass sites don't always look just like turfgrass. They often get weeds within them too. So it's not like a desert compared to an oasis here as well. There's some variety. The strongest relationship we identified, however, was that native larvae abundance was influenced by presence of a large green space in the landscape. So we can see that here in this like huge park that was present in the landscape. And the presence of a larger park within an urban area really improved the number of bees that we found are within a bee nest. So how many larvae were actually developing. So there's something about these large green spaces that help support urban bee populations. And we're not able to tell entirely what that is, but we know that their presence is important. We also wanted to know if the mechanism behind why they are native flowering plants, why they had more bees with it, was because the bees were feeding off of the native plants that we had input into a particular urban area too. So essentially, if we do plant native plants, do urban bees use these plants too? So we monitored more nesting bees in the same wildflower habitats I previously mentioned, and also within urban farms in Cleveland. And we again trap nested bees and were able to look at larvae abundance and the pollen within these trap nests too. The new thing with this project is not only did we count the larvae that were within these nests, we also took the pollen out of the nests and were able to look at the pollen DNA to ask this question, what were they feeding off of? So with our molecular work, we're able to say, were they feeding off of the native plants or were they feeding off of something else? What we found is that they weren't feeding off of the native plants as much as we had hoped. So instead, the bees were predominantly visiting urban spontaneous vegetation or weeds from the Fabaceae family. So this includes clovers essentially too. So for instance, red clover composed 50% of all the pollen DNA that we identified from these nesting straws. And here's a graph for native bees and the different plant genera they were interested in. Don't need to get into weeds with that, but look at the colors. So yellow here is weedy plants, and you can see that most of what all these native bees were feeding off of was weedy plants, although occasionally they fed off of something like asparagus or raspberry, which was a planted plant in the farm, or some of the native flowering prairie species that we had put into these sites, which is represented here in dark green. However, at large, bees weren't just feeding off of these were the predominant resources, but they were also capitalizing on all those different plants that everyone has in their backyards and parks throughout the urban environment. So we did record pollen collection from over 100 plant genera. And the ability of a bee to access a diverse diet seemed to be driven by the presence again here of a large green space within the landscape. So the diversity of a pollen a bee feeds on tended to increase, if you see this trend line, with the presence of a larger green space patch within the landscape, likely because these contained greater foraging opportunities for bees. So I'm not getting into the weeds much with the research here, but I kind of want to provide a case study because there's so much to learn. And what we know, for at least my background here, is from a lot of this work that was in depth here in Cleveland too. But some of the key findings I would want to highlight here is that we did find native wildflower habitats enhanced native bee nesting. Um, we also found that they weren't necessarily feeding on these native wildflower habitats. They were mostly feeding off of urban weeds. So there's value to both of these types of foraging resources. Like, where obviously they're good for nesting, but also while using some of that pollen from these native flowers, most bees use the weeds that were present within the urban environment too. And we also established that landscape where we put a green space or where a park is situated is really important for nesting success and how many plants a bee tends to eat. And then that this plant diversity that bees feed on can be really important for larval development as well too. So we're finding this consistent pattern that a large green space patch can be very important too. Okay. So what does this mean for people like me or you who might just want to help save the bees in your particular area, maybe your town or your city or even your backyard too? So I kind of wanted to just take a second to kind of distill this into some steps that we could consider for how we could manage our habitats and our landscapes too here. So in applying these lessons from Cleveland, one thing that we wanted to emphasize is that we know that bees feed on weeds. So something that's really important is to reduce the area that you need to mow in your backyard. I know we've talked about like no mow May. That's one way to kind of approach it. Another way to approach it is just every year leave a little bit more strip of weeds that's prevalent in your backyard. You could choose maybe to not mow as often, to do delayed mowing. So something that research has shown is that mowing every 3 weeks versus every 2 weeks versus every week, you see an increase in bee diversity the more that you delay your mowing. Or if you wanted to have a lawn, you could plant a flowering lawn, such as one like this, that incorporates these plants intentionally into a lower landscape or lower height flowering lawn. Many people like to plant gardens. We encourage that. We also emphasize, based off of our research, that native plant species are important for bees. And there are some specialist bees, I didn't get into this with the research so much, that wouldn't necessarily feed off of those weeds. They only wanted a particular native plant too. And things like milkweed here could be also important for other insect species like monarchs. So we do emphasize that planting native species, especially in your backyard, can be really important. And if you do this type of work, it's important to think about providing a variety of colors and shapes to attract different pollinators. It's important to think about planting these plants in dense patches as opposed to just scattered throughout a larger area, because bees tend to be efficient foragers, so they tend to go towards dense patches, and it makes them fly less, so they have to waste less energy in flying from one patch to the other. We also want to think in planning and designing our gardens about a curve of when these flowers are available for bees throughout the whole growing season. So you want early spring plants, we want trees, those are really good for bees. We also want summer blooming plants and maybe fall goldenrod and stuff like that too. And the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation has great planting lists for people in different areas as well. We also want to think about nesting. So something that our research showed is that we get a lot of these urban cavity nesters within cities and other suburban areas. And so if you're going to encourage them, you could leave hollow stems in your yard. You could not cut them until later on in May, and that will allow them to develop over the winter and then come out and emerge and have the next generation. So things like sunflowers, teasel, fennel, brambles, raspberries are all great for that. And we don't know a lot about bee nesting. So a lot of this is based off of assumptions, but one assumption people have made is that creating bare ground or leaving sandy areas could also be good for most of those ground nesters as well. And finally, especially in urban areas, I wanted to emphasize that social contagion is really important here too. So we think about like larger green spaces being potentially good for bees. That's not something that you can do by yourself. That is something that we can do in collaboration with larger organizations, in talking with like neighbors. You could create larger habitats for bees and other insects, but only in groups of people working together too. So we think about how we can plug into other resources in our environment, or maybe even just talking to our neighbors about what we're doing, why we delayed mowing in our yard, putting up a sign. Some of these steps can help us kind of work together to help save the bees. So that's our Blitz talk for today. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer some in the chat. Also, if people wanted to see any of those particular PDFs for the resources that I mentioned, I'm happy to provide those too. Just put it in the chat, or you can send me an email as well too. So turo@fordham.edu.
Well, that was amazing, Katie. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I like how you set the scene and then you gave us some really practical options to help save the bees. Um, I see that there's other questions coming in, but the first one that came in that I wanted to share was someone had heard that urban bees are doing better than rural bee populations, and they wanted to get your thoughts on that, whether there were differences in landscaping in rural areas or maybe more use of pesticides and herbicides in suburban type areas.
So, something we do know first on the pesticide front is that a lot of urban areas don't have as heavy pesticide loads because people aren't, especially in urban farms, aren't allowed to use some of these more intensive pesticides. So, that is something that it's a different stressor if we're going to compare rural versus urban environments. But I wouldn't say that I know that we can directly compare the two and say one is doing worse than the other. It's kind of just different. So there's different bees that live in these different areas. So it's not the same species often. And they're facing different challenges and different opportunities. That being said, we do know that there's this like kind of counterintuitive sense that we get many diverse and abundant bee communities in urban areas, and that's directly tied to the fact that people plant flowers in urban areas. It's densely put together so the bees can capitalize on that too. So we do think of urban areas as having conservation potential. It somewhat matters about what those sites look like, how we design them, what species we include, and also how they're connected together to like form a larger group of green spaces that bees can travel to as well. And I also just briefly just want to mention that in thinking about rural versus urban areas, we often think about like summer ag versus like urban areas. And there are many, many forest bees that we also could consider rural. And those are very different than the summer bees. So in forested areas, and this is a lot of what my current research is about, we get spring bees that are only out in the spring and only in forests. And that's a whole nother research area. But it's not, it's this is what I mean about different bee communities. It's not directly comparable.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I encourage folks, if you have additional questions, to put them in the chat. At this time, we are going to go to our IPM minute, and I will actually be presenting that topic today. So hopefully you'll see my screen here. Today for our IPM minute, not directly related to our initial topic, but something that you might think about for the next month or so is saying no to bug zappers. So we'll get underway and start with what are bug zappers? These are light traps that use a UV light and an electrical field to electrocute any insects that approach that light source. And I feel like many of the people on this call today are probably not folks that are using these types of light traps, but maybe one of your family members or someone else you know is using them. So hopefully we can arm you with some information about them. Why do people use these devices? They are marketed as a protection against biting insects, whether that is nighttime biting mosquitoes or biting midges. People that are spending time outdoors in the summer, the warm weather, are exposed to these biting insects and are trying to prevent that with some kind of trap. Unfortunately, for many people, there is a false positive feedback with these devices where every time they hear the zapping sound, they think they're killing their target pest of mosquitoes. And as we'll see in the next couple of slides, that may not necessarily be the case, that we may be killing other organisms that are beneficial to our local ecology. And there's a lack of understanding about the importance and value of biodiversity. We just heard a wonderful talk about the daytime flying pollinators and bees, but night flying insects are also pollinators as well. So things that are attracted to light could include pollinators, parasitic wasps that help manage pestiferous populations in our environment. And because of their intrinsic value, we don't necessarily want to be killing these organisms. So do these bug zappers work? It depends on your definition. They do kill a lot of insects. Unfortunately, they don't often kill the target insects that we're trying to manage, those insects that are biting us at night. There's been a few studies of these devices. A notable one is from Frick and Doug Tallamy, who many of you know, related to planting native plants. And in their study, they looked at the trap captures from 6 different residential properties in around Newark, Delaware, and they recorded 13,789 killed insects, and only 31 of those, which equates to 0.22%, were mosquitoes. So very low number of the target organism actually being killed by these devices. That's because many mosquito species are not attracted to light. They're more attracted to the cues that are emitted by people, our carbon dioxide, the heat that is generated from our body. So the trap itself is not designed to attract the biting insects. And the Ptolemy and Frick paper also indicated that these devices may kill billions of non-target insects every single day. When they published this paper in 96, it was relatively easy to acquire a bug zapper. At this point, you could go on to a big box store's website, purchase it, and have it the next day. So it's even easier and probably more prevalent than it was in the past. They're also bad because these bug zappers, when they kill insects, spread those particles. And there's research demonstrating that they are disseminating pathogens from bacteria to viruses. So people using these to protect spaces around their pools and other locations are actually spreading pathogens onto surfaces nearby. So real quickly, what can you do instead? If you're worried about mosquitoes, we could reduce habitat by eliminating standing water, whether that's in our gutters or pots or other types of items that are left in the yard. We could try to minimize resting habitats that are near spaces where we're trying to protect, like our patio. We can cover our bare skin if we're out at night, maybe wear long sleeves to prevent insects from biting us. We could use an effective repellent or physical screens, things like actual screen houses or strong fans to keep the insects away from us. And finally, there are spatial repellents if people are interested in that type of approach where it is emitting a vapor insecticide. It does have repellent activity. It will knock down any mosquitoes that come into that space, and it can be lethal at a close distance. This is not something that personally I would utilize because it is emitting an insecticide right around me, but the physical exclusion is probably a better option.